Hi, I'm Scott Roth. I am the instructor for HI 151, and I am posting two video lectures for week two. So the first, English colonies in the 18th century. One important detail to remember is that the British colonists were quite distant from the British homeland and its government. The concept of direct rule was thus impossible because of this distance and allowed for the early flowering of some challenging or revolutionary thinking. Virginia House of Burgesses, for example, offered the first truly representative assembly in the Western Hemisphere. Pilgrims sought separation from the Church of England and did not do so simply in religious terms, but in political terms as well, embracing home rule via the Mayflower Compact before they even entered the New World. New England town meetings provided an outlet for people to share their ideas, to speak their minds, to have their voices heard. Quakers promoted equality and similar ideals. Now, not all were free and treated equally, obviously, but these ideas were quite radical at the time, owing to the ideas of the Enlightenment that was occurring as these colonies were developing. Now, we'll talk more about the Enlightenment in the second video lecture for week two. So what was New England like early on? How did they survive, and what were the differences between the colonies? Massachusetts Bay Colony was the brainchild of John Winthrop and the Puritans. Now, New England was set up with a very minimal democratic nature. There was some representation, to be sure, but there was a strict order that underscored life throughout New England. There was political order, economic, social, religious, even cultural. This is what my master's thesis was on, if anybody's interested in reading it. There were the few which sat as political leaders. Important to note that one had to be a member of the Puritan Church in New England to even have a vote. There was a social order as well. One's class determined one's rank in society. Sumptuary laws, for example, discriminated against those of what was considered mean condition. The goal was to prevent those of a lower status from emulating those of a higher status. This was an effort to control the social order, to prevent pride and envy from taking over those of what we might call the plebeian class. Significantly, this also reflected one's spiritual status. Social and economic standing represented one's elect status. Thus, this type of demarcation served two purposes. For example, women of higher rank were allowed to wear silk petticoats, whereas those of a meaner sort were limited to woolen stuff. Laborers and servants wore leather clothing, Irish stockings, and shoes of wooden heels, while gentlemen were given more options, such as doublets worn over a sleeved waistcoat, trunk hose, and long stockings, as well as shoes tied or ornamented with rosettes. The October 4th, 1651 sumptuary law placed strict limits. Those who enjoyed an estate worth 200 pounds or more were allowed freedom of dress, whereas those below this level were quite restricted. Even ministers like John Downham and Thomas Perkins argued that this differentiation was necessary, that attire provided one example of glorification of God, but that those who were economically and thus spiritually successful were allowed more ornamentation and thus more glorification of God. Now, it is important to note sumptuary laws have a long history in Europe, well before they came to the colonies. So this is a long-standing tradition, if you will, of maintaining social order. Now, along these lines, there were even designated places for churchgoers to sit during services. Those spots were based on a family's economic and social standing. Thus, those of the highest standing were able to sit closest to the minister. Those of the lowest condition sometimes did not even have an assigned seat and had to battle for a spot during services, whereas others simply had seats that were located at a distance away from the minister. Again, all this depended on one's economic and social status. Yes, it was that specific. Where you sat at church was defined by this order. Now, control was only one part of the legacy of Massachusetts Bay Colony in New England. Literacy rates were extremely high. Massachusetts law required tax-supported schools for communities, 17th century. Life expectancy was higher in England than in England, and substantially higher than what we would see in the southern colonies. You can consider, why would that be? Church attendance was mandatory. In some ways, this was a theocracy, as the government enforced biblical law as well as English civil and criminal law. Now, those who did not conform to Puritan ways and the prescribed order were marginalized or often simply kicked out of the colony. Read my thesis for more on that. Pilgrims settled Plymouth Rock. The main difference between them and Puritans was that Pilgrims sought complete separation from the Church of England, whereas Puritans sought to purify the Church of England, or reform it. Plymouth grew slowly, prospering from farming, fishing, and lumbering, as well as some fur trade with Native Americans. And this is very much what we see with the rest of the New England colony, with Massachusetts Bay Colony. Trade would pick up considerably, though, over the course of the 17th century. Now, the middle colonies were comprised of what would become New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. They were initially settled by the Dutch and Swedes. The English seized the area in 1664. Now, this was a diverse population which practiced religious toleration and offered a multicultural, commercially oriented, and competitive society. It grew significantly between 1665 and 1685, helping to foster cultural diversity that had always characterized the region. For example, we see French Protestants, Quakers, Presbyterians, alongside English, Dutch, and German merchants. The work and ideas of William Penn, who was the founder of Pennsylvania, should be recognized here. Penn believed in religious freedom, he believed in political rights, and he believed in land ownership. Penn practiced Quakerism, and the ideals emanating from this sect dominated practice in the colony. Folks were allowed to practice the religion of their choice. Now, Quakers always sought converts, but respected other religions more than most did. Politically, the colony was focused on egalitarianism. All free male residents had the right to vote, and the legislature had full governing powers. And because Penn wanted to avoid powerful landlords and economically dependent tenant farmers, he promoted a society of independent land-owning farm families. Now, this was the ideal that Thomas Jefferson would espouse a couple generations later and make his ideal for America. Notably, Penn insisted that all land be purchased from Indians fairly rather than simply taken. And Penn was not limited to English, but also welcomed Irish, Scottish, Welsh, French, Scandinavian, and German settlers. The Upper South consisted of Maryland and Virginia. Now, these colonies focused on tobacco, which required cheap labor. Poor young Englishmen served as the source of labor as indentured servants for quite a while, working without pay in exchange for passage to the colonies. Now, to be sure, the Upper South differed from New England in significant ways. Primarily, those who peopled this region were motivated by economic opportunity and wealth, not about escaping religious persecution. Now, again, in New England, economic opportunity is one reason people migrate to Massachusetts Bay Colony or to New England in general. It was not solely about avoiding religious persecution, but in the Upper South, we see more strictly about economic opportunity and an eschewal, really, of religion. Now, that said, Maryland was initially a Catholic experiment under Lord Baltimore, yet the main motivation for these migrants was, again, still economics. It developed economically in a similar fashion to Virginia, and tobacco would become its most important cash crop. Now, the lower or deep South included Georgia and the Carolinas, and was a society based around yeoman farmers. In some ways, the lower South reflected medieval society. There were landowners, there were yeomen or independent farmers, and there were serfs that were bound to work the land for their landlord. Agriculture here was labor-intensive, crops like sugar, rice, and later cotton, thus necessitating many workers at a cheap rate. Indentured servants were a large part of the working force initially in the New World, but slavery became a staple in the South due to the soil and the resulting crops. There was some experimentation with trade, but cattle raising and later rice cultivation provided the true path to riches. Significantly, the Carolina colony was initially peopled by planters who relocated from the Caribbean island of Barbados, where sugar was the main crop. Their experiences on Barbados would shape their actions and attitudes in the Carolinas as well. Georgia was the other Deep South colony. Originally intended to provide a destination for those imprisoned for minor debts, to be a quote-unquote refuge for the deserving poor, the colony was ultimately seen as a buffer between Spanish Florida and the economically successful southern half of Carolina. Now, by 1729, this southern half of Carolina would be known as South Carolina. Very challenging, right? There were no political rights, and ultimately middle-class English immigrants would move there with South Carolinians who sought land, and moved to the colony and began to demand such rights. They would garner the right to accumulate and sell land, and ultimately would introduce slave labor to the area. These southern colonies faced many issues, though, primarily those relating to disease. Outbreaks of malaria and yellow fever kept life expectancy low. Because of the demographics of these colonies, mostly young and male, there was little natural population growth. Additionally, this individualized migration provided less support than the family-dominated migration in New England. Additionally, because of the type of crop grown in the South, cheap labor was a necessity for profits. Initially, indentured servants satisfied this need, but over time this would change, and slavery again would be introduced. We will discuss the institution of slavery, known as the peculiar institution, a few weeks down the road, but suffice to say that slavery was introduced as an economic institution. It was not about race, though there are different theories as to the importance of race to American slavery. But again, more details on this later. But slavery, again, is about the maximization of profit, the need for cheap labor. Now, Eric Williams is one historian who has argued that racism developed from the institution of slavery, that slavery was not created because of racism. Williams is I would just go ahead and call him a radical historian. So when somebody like him argues that, you know that that's a pretty safe bet. Now, this is similar to the longer history of slavery. This was not an American invention. It was not solely tied to the New World. The institution itself can be found throughout history. But again, it's important to recognize that slavery, again, it has its own development. And much of it, again, comes from the experiences of those people in the Caribbean who raise sugar. They kind of transport that. And with regard to slavery, depending on how in-depth I get in that video lecture, slavery was much more, how shall I put it, inhumane in the Caribbean than it would be on the mainland. Not that it was good on the mainland, but it was definitely much more brutal in the Caribbean, and that's why we see the revolution in Haiti in the early 19th century. All right, that's the end of the first. I will come back with a second that will focus on women and their role in the early republic, in colonial America. We'll talk a little bit about the Enlightenment and how these ideas kind of lead to revolution.